How does someone go from atheist to mystic, from professor to prisoner? What kind of truth is so compelling it can transform a skeptical intellectual into a contemplative nun? And why did Edith's final silence speak louder than all the Nazi propaganda machines combined? This is the story of Saint Edith Stein, the woman who proved that the greatest revolutions happen not in the streets, but in the human heart. If you've ever struggled to find meaning in suffering, let this story show you how one woman transformed tragedy into triumph through the power of faith. And what can transform a skeptic into a saint, a philosopher into a prisoner? Edith Stein's journey holds the answer. Don't miss it. Hit like and subscribe for more powerful stories of love triumphing over despair. On the 12th of October 1891, in the Prussian city of Breslau, a girl was born who would one day bridge the worlds of philosophy and mysticism, Judaism and Christianity, academic brilliance, and contemplative silence. Edith Stein entered a world where intellectual achievement was prized above all else, where reason was considered the highest human faculty, and where faith was increasingly seen as the enemy of progress. Edith was the youngest of 11 children born to Siegfried and August Stein, devout Orthodox Jews who ran a successful lumber business. The Stein household was one where Hebrew prayers mingled with German philosophy, where ancient traditions coexisted with modern aspirations, and where education was considered both a privilege and a responsibility. From her earliest years, Edith displayed an intellectual intensity that amazed her family. She learned to read before starting school, devoured books with insatiable hunger, and asked questions that often left adults speechless. Her mind was like a precision instrument, capable of analyzing complex ideas with remarkable clarity and penetrating to the heart of philosophical problems that baffled her professors. But brilliance came with a price. As Edith's intellectual powers developed, her faith began to crumble. The rational, scientific worldview she encountered in her studies seemed incompatible with the religious traditions of her childhood. By adolescence, she had quietly abandoned belief in God, embracing the atheism that was fashionable among German intellectuals. "I consciously decided to give up praying," she later wrote. "I thought that the rational, scientific approach to life was incompatible with faith." This crisis of faith devastated her mother, Auguste, who watched helplessly as her brilliant youngest daughter drifted away from the religious moorings that had sustained the Stein family for generations. But Auguste continued to pray for Edith, believing that the God who had given her such extraordinary gifts would somehow lead her back to truth. Edith's academic career was meteoric. She studied philosophy at the University of Breslau, then moved to the University of Göttingen to study under Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology. Her doctoral dissertation on empathy was recognized as a work of extraordinary depth and originality, establishing her as one of Germany's most promising young philosophers. But even as Edith achieved academic success, she felt an inner emptiness that no intellectual achievement could fill. She was searching for truth, but the rational materialism that dominated German universities left her spiritually starved. She had gained the whole world of academic recognition, but was losing something essential to her soul. The breakthrough would come from an unexpected source, a book that would shatter her atheistic worldview and begin her journey toward the Catholic Church. In 1921, while visiting friends, Edith picked up a book that would transform her life, the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Avila. She had intended to browse through it casually, but instead found herself reading straight through the night, completely captivated by the Spanish mystic's account of her spiritual journey. "When I had finished the book," Edith later recalled, "I said to myself, 'This is the truth.' The impact was immediate and overwhelming." Here was an intellect as rigorous as her own, a woman who had wrestled with the deepest philosophical questions, but who had found in mystical experience a source of knowledge that transcended purely rational inquiry. Teresa's combination of intellectual sophistication and spiritual depth spoke to something in Edith that she hadn't even known was missing. The next morning, Edith walked to the local Catholic church and bought a catechism and a missal. She spent the following weeks studying Catholic doctrine with the same intensity she had once brought to phenomenological analysis. What she discovered was not the anti-intellectual superstition she had expected, but a theological system of remarkable depth and coherence. On the 1st of January 1922, Edith Stein was baptized into the Catholic Church. The brilliant atheist who had spent years demolishing religious belief had become a Catholic convert whose faith was grounded not in emotion, but in the conviction that she had found ultimate truth. The conversion devastated her family, particularly her mother, who saw it as a betrayal of their Jewish heritage and a rejection of everything she held dear. The woman who had prayed for Edith's return to faith was heartbroken to discover that her prayers had been answered in a way she never expected. "Why did you have to get to know Christianity?" Auguste asked her daughter through tears. "I don't want to say anything against your faith, but why did it have to be Christianity?" The pain of causing her beloved mother such anguish was almost unbearable for Edith, but she couldn't deny the truth she had discovered. She had found in Catholic teaching not just intellectual satisfaction, but spiritual nourishment that fed her deepest hunger. Edith's conversion marked the beginning of a new phase in her intellectual life. She became a bridge builder between Catholic theology and modern philosophy, showing that faith and reason were not enemies, but partners in the search for truth. She translated the works of Thomas Aquinas into German and wrote groundbreaking essays on phenomenology and Catholic thought. But even as she achieved recognition as one of Europe's foremost Catholic intellectuals, Edith felt called to something deeper than academic success. The silence of the cloister was beginning to call her name. Throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Edith established herself as one of Germany's most respected Catholic intellectuals. She taught at Catholic schools, wrote extensively on philosophy and theology, and became a sought-after lecturer who could fill auditoriums with her brilliant expositions of complex philosophical ideas. But success in the academic world couldn't silence the growing call she felt to religious life. Since her conversion, Edith had been increasingly drawn to contemplative prayer and the mystical tradition represented by saints like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. She felt called not just to study about God, but to give her life completely to the pursuit of union with divine love. The call to enter the Carmelite order, the same religious community that had produced Teresa of Avila, grew stronger with each passing year. But Edith hesitated, knowing that her entry into the convent would be another devastating blow to her aging mother who had never fully accepted her daughter's conversion to Christianity. For years, Edith struggled with this conflict between her sense of religious calling and her love for her family. She continued her academic work while deepening her spiritual life, hoping that time would somehow resolve the tension between these competing claims on her heart. The decision was finally forced by events beyond her control. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, and the systematic persecution of Jews began almost immediately. New laws barred Jewish academics from teaching in German schools and universities, effectively ending Edith's career as a Catholic educator. Suddenly, the path to Carmel was clear. Edith could no longer serve God through academic work in Nazi Germany, but she could serve him through prayer and contemplation behind convent walls. On the 14th of October 1933, at the age of 42, Dr. Edith Stein entered the Carmelite monastery in Cologne, taking the religious name Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. The intellectual who had spent her life analyzing the nature of human experience was about to embark on the ultimate human experience: complete surrender to divine love. But the Nazi persecution that had pushed her toward the cloister would also follow her there. Her mother, Auguste, died in 1936, never having been reconciled to her daughter's conversion, but having maintained their relationship despite the pain it caused her. Edith was devastated by the loss, but also relieved that her mother had been spared the worst of what was to come. The storm clouds gathering over Europe would soon engulf even the walls of Carmel. Within the walls of the Carmelite monastery in Cologne, Edith underwent a transformation as profound as her conversion to Catholicism. The brilliant philosopher who had spent her life in the world of ideas now entered the realm of pure contemplation, where knowledge came not through analysis but through loving surrender to divine mystery. Edith embraced monastic life with characteristic intensity. She threw herself into the rhythm of prayer, work, and study that marked Carmelite spirituality, finding in the monastery's silence a peace that her years of academic success had never provided. The woman who had once filled lecture halls with her brilliant discourse now found her greatest joy in the wordless communion of contemplative prayer. But Edith didn't abandon her intellectual gifts upon entering Carmel. Instead, she brought them to the service of her new calling, writing what would become her masterwork, The Science of the Cross, a profound meditation on the spirituality of Saint John of the Cross and the meaning of redemptive suffering. In this work, Edith explored the paradox that had become central to her own life: how suffering, when united to the cross of Christ, could become a source of spiritual fruitfulness and redemptive grace. She wrote from personal experience, having suffered the pain of family rejection, career loss, and the growing persecution of her fellow Jews. The bride must be like the bridegroom. She wrote, "If we want to share in his glory, we must share in his suffering." As the Nazi persecution intensified, Edith watched with growing horror as her Jewish relatives and friends faced escalating violence and discrimination. From behind the grill of the monastery, she could do nothing to help them physically, but she could offer something perhaps more powerful: her prayers and her willingness to suffer in solidarity with her persecuted people. Edith began to see her religious vocation in terms of vicarious suffering for the Jewish people. She offered herself as a sacrifice for the conversion of the Jews and for the end of the persecution that was destroying so many innocent lives. Her contemplative life became a form of spiritual resistance to the evil spreading across Europe. In 1938, as anti-Semitic violence reached new heights with Kristallnacht, Edith wrote to her prioress, "I keep thinking of Queen Esther, who was taken away from her people, precisely that she might represent them before the king. Perhaps the Lord is also keeping me for that purpose." But the walls of the monastery could not protect her forever from the racial hatred that the Nazis had unleashed. How do you fight evil when you've chosen the path of silence and prayer? By 1940, the Nazi occupation of Holland had brought the persecution of Jews to the very doorstep of the Carmelite monastery where Edith had sought refuge. The Dutch Carmelites, recognizing the danger she faced, had transferred her to their monastery in Echt, hoping that neutral Holland would provide safety for their Jewish sister. But the Nazi racial laws recognized no distinction between practicing Jews and Jewish converts to Christianity. In the twisted logic of Nazi ideology, Edith's conversion to Catholicism was irrelevant. Her Jewish ancestry marked her for persecution regardless of her religious beliefs. As the deportations of Dutch Jews began in 1942, the Catholic bishops of Holland issued a courageous pastoral letter denouncing the persecution and demanding justice for all victims, regardless of their race or religion. The letter was read from every Catholic pulpit in the country, creating the first organized religious resistance to Nazi racial policies in occupied Europe. Hitler's response was swift and brutal. In retaliation for the bishops' protest, the Nazis ordered the immediate arrest of all Jewish converts to Christianity in the Netherlands. It was a calculated act of revenge designed to punish the Catholic Church for its moral courage. On the 2nd of August 1942, the Gestapo arrived at the Carmelite monastery in Echt. They gave Edith and her sister Rosa, who had also converted to Catholicism and was living at the monastery as an extern sister, just 5 minutes to pack their belongings. As they were led away, witnesses reported that Edith was completely calm, even comforting her terrified sister with words that would be remembered forever. "Come, Rosa. We're going for our people." In that moment, Edith understood that her arrest was not just personal tragedy, but spiritual opportunity. She was being called to unite her suffering with Christ's passion, to become a living sacrifice for the salvation of the Jewish people and for the defeat of the evil that threatened to engulf the world. The train that carried her away from the monastery was heading toward Auschwitz, but Edith saw it as carrying her toward her ultimate union with the God she had served with her brilliant mind and loving heart. The silence she had chosen would soon become eternal, but it would speak louder than any words. The transport train that carried Edith Stein to Auschwitz on the 7th of August 1942 was packed with Jewish converts to Christianity who had been arrested in retaliation for the Dutch bishop's protest. Among them were priests, nuns, and lay people who had thought their conversion to Christianity would protect them from Nazi racial persecution. Witnesses later testified that throughout the horrific journey, Edith remained a source of strength and comfort to her fellow prisoners. She organized care for the children who had been separated from their parents, led prayers for those who wanted spiritual comfort, and maintained a dignity that seemed to come from beyond the natural order. Sister Teresa Benedicta was like an angel among us. One survivor recalled, she never thought of herself, only of how she could help others. Even in that terrible situation, she radiated peace. When the train arrived at Auschwitz on the 9th of August 1942, Edith Stein, philosopher, mystic, and bridge between Judaism and Christianity, was immediately sent to the gas chambers along with her sister Rosa and hundreds of other innocent victims. She was 50 years old. The exact details of her final hours remain unknown, lost in the systematic murder machine that the Nazis had created at Auschwitz. But those who knew Edith were certain that she faced death with the same courage and faith that had marked her entire journey from atheism to mysticism. Her death certificate, if such a thing could exist in the bureaucracy of genocide, might have read, "Victim of racial hatred." But the truth was far more profound. Edith Stein had died as she had lived since her conversion, as a witness to the truth that love is stronger than hatred, that faith can triumph over despair, and that no earthly power can destroy a soul that belongs completely to God. The woman who had chosen silence over the world's applause had made her final statement. In choosing to die with her people rather than seeking safety through her religious vocation, she had demonstrated the ultimate meaning of solidarity and love. The Nazis thought they were eliminating a Jewish intellectual who had betrayed her race by converting to Christianity. In reality, they had created a martyr whose witness would inspire millions and whose silence would speak more powerfully than any philosophical treatise. But death was not the end of Edith's influence. It was the beginning of her universal impact. The recognition of Edith Stein's sanctity began almost immediately after the war's end. Holocaust survivors who had known her testified to her extraordinary holiness and courage. The Catholic Church began investigating her life and martyrdom, recognizing that her death represented something far more than individual tragedy. Pope John Paul II, himself a Polish survivor of Nazi persecution, had a special devotion to Edith Stein. He beatified her in 1987 and canonized her as a saint on the 11th of October 1998, declaring her a martyr who had died in hatred of the faith rather than simply as a victim of racial persecution. But the Pope went even further, declaring Saint Edith Stein, Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, a co-patron of Europe alongside Saint Bridget of Sweden and Saint Catherine of Siena. In this designation, he recognized her unique role as a bridge between different worlds: Judaism and Christianity, philosophy and mysticism, intellectual achievement and contemplative surrender. Today, Saint Edith Stein is venerated not only by Catholics, but by people of all faiths who recognize in her story a powerful witness to the triumph of love over hatred. Her philosophical works continue to be studied in universities worldwide, while her spiritual writings inspire contemplatives and mystics seeking deeper union with God. Perhaps most significantly, she has become a patron saint of Jewish-Christian dialogue and understanding. Her life demonstrates that it is possible to embrace Christianity without rejecting one's Jewish heritage, to find in Jesus Christ the fulfillment rather than the denial of Jewish hopes and dreams. The woman who defied Hitler with silence speaks powerfully to our contemporary world, where religious differences often lead to conflict and misunderstanding. Her witness suggests that authentic encounter with truth leads not to division, but to deeper appreciation of what we share as human beings created in God's image. Her feast day, August 9, is observed not only as a celebration of her sanctity, but as a reminder that the greatest resistance to evil comes not through violence, but through the patient witness of love, lived authentically, even unto death. Saint Edith Stein, philosopher and mystic, Jew and Christian, intellectual and contemplative, reminds us that the human journey toward truth often requires us to transcend the categories that divide us and embrace the mystery that unites us all. Her silence in the face of ultimate evil proved more eloquent than any argument, her death more powerful than any philosophy, her love more enduring than any hatred. She shows us that the greatest victory over evil comes not through matching its violence, but through choosing love so completely that darkness cannot extinguish the light. Edith Stein discovered that the greatest defiance of evil is the choice to love without condition, to seek truth without compromise, and to offer one's life as a bridge between worlds that seem impossibly divided. Her legacy invites us to follow the same path of costly love.